So weird. Last week when you interviewed Logan Metesh, I confessed rather ashamedly that I had never heard of John Pedersen. And then I listened to this segment where you and he discussed the Pedersen device of World War I. And I went, oh, no, I have heard of this. I know exactly what you're talking about. But because I read it, I didn't know he was pronounced Pedersen. I read it more as Peterson, and Pedersen became Peterson. So in my mind, I thought it was the Petersen device. Mm-hmm. And so now I hope I can redeem myself by going, yes, I did actually know something about this man. Now, for our listeners who have no clue what I'm talking about, well, Logan is here to explain to you in great detail what the Pedersen device was and how it could have changed history.
So we were talking previously about the history of John Pedersen and his firearms design, one of the more lesser known firearms greats in American history. And so joining me again is Logan Metesh of High Caliber History. How you doing, Logan?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing great. So where do we leave off?
So we left off after having talked about some of the early pump guns that John Pedersen created, and we went through his guns that were competing with the M1 rifle, and we talked about his handgun designs, but we definitely left off some of his most influential and well-known pieces, and we figured we would dedicate a new segment to those guns. So in World War I, the M1903 and the M1917 30-06 bolt-action rifles are the gun that most of the American doughboys are fielding. And, of course, as the war slogs on year after year after year, it's hard to gain ground because they're stuck in the trenches and they need to find a way to break through no man's land and really go on the offensive. And so John Pedersen begins in 1915 designing what is going to become a secret weapon for our doughboys, and he's getting things squared away between 1915 and 1917, and eventually he creates something that is supposed to be an absolute game changer and is designed to be put into use in the spring offensive in 1919, which of course doesn't ever end up happening because the armistice is signed at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, and the war is over. But what he creates is something really, really remarkable and unusual. It's what is very inventively named the Pedersen device. And this is a unit that takes the place of the bolt in a bolt-action rifle. And so you slide the bolt out of the 1903, and you slide the Pedersen device into its space, and then attach a 40-round magazine with a 30 caliber pistol cartridge in it. And that takes your bolt action rifle and transforms it into a semi-automatic. And the goal behind this was to give the American forces something that they could come out of the trenches and make their way through no man's land, and with adequate firepower, faster firepower, that they could keep moving forward and go on and really have an impact in moving the lines during World War I's stalemated trench warfare. It's a really fascinating concept and a really, really neat design. But again, if you listened to our previous segment, one of the things that I said over and over and over again was that it was too little too late. And the Pedersen device never sees combat. They made about 65,000 of them. So out of the 65,000 that were made, most of them ended up being destroyed because the government didn't want to pay to store stuff that they were never going to use. So consequently, they're incredibly rare. Somewhere between 70 and 100 of them managed to survive the destruction. And they're an incredibly cool piece of what should have been World War I history. But of course, it never comes to fruition. And like many things in John Pedersen's career, it just doesn't quite make it over the top. and it kind of stalls out there. But that doesn't change the fact that he was a fantastic designer, and it was a fantastic, innovative piece that I really do think could have turned the tide of the war had it slogged on into a spring offensive in 1919. Of course, we were fortunate enough that it didn't.
So I want to get into a little bit of technical details on this device, just because I think unless someone's literally like looked at articles or seen stuff written about this device, they might not fully understand what we're talking about. So now I believe for a Springfield 1903 to accept this, it needed to have an ejection port cut into the receiver. Is that correct?
That's correct. They ended up creating what was known as the M1903 Mark I, and it had a little bit of a bump out in the stock on the left-hand side, as well as a slot in the receiver on the left-hand side, acting as the ejection port.
And I mean, you referred to it. Was it called 30 caliber pistol? What was the cartridge designation?
Yeah, it was 30 caliber pistol, and it was kind of, the way I understand it, it was kind of designated as that in order to confuse anyone who might have gotten wind of the design and what was coming. They would think it was just a new handgun design that the military was going to be fielding, not a new long gun conversion.
Yeah, and what were the technical specs on that cartridge? So really, it was a pistol cartridge.
It was. It absolutely was a pistol cartridge, very similar to what ends up becoming the 7.65 pistol cartridge. So it's certainly not the most potent thing out there, but that really wasn't the point. The point was, peace through superior firepower in terms of numbers, and having a 40 round stick mag sticking out of the side there. That was really what it was all about. It was about being able to fire much more rapidly, and much more efficiently, and having more rounds at your disposal than you would have had working with that bolt action rifle if it were still in 30-06. And you can switch back and forth. That's still the beauty of it, is that, if you run out of these 30 caliber pistol cartridges, just pull the Pedersen device out, slide your standard bolt back in, and load some 30-06, and you're back in business. So it was really innovative that it didn't require any permanent alteration of the gun in order to use it. That was a really cool feature of it, especially because the Pedersen device was a little finicky, and it was not something that was terribly user-friendly to try to repair in the field. I've had the pleasure or displeasure, depending on how you look at it, to disassemble one of these pieces because we were needing to get some internal measurements taken off of it, and it came apart easy enough, but trying to put it back together, I found myself in need of a third hand that I simply don't have. And I actually ended up, after about an hour, I was frustrated enough that I had to grab a colleague to come over and hold on to part of it so that I could get the pieces back together, because it's just not possible with two hands. And I can't imagine trying to do it in the trenches in World War I while you're being shelled. That's just not feasible. If it were me, I would be like, to hell with it, throw it to the side, pop the regular bolt back in, and just run 30-06.
Yeah. And again, another thing to think about is that, I mean, at the time, it's a pistol caliber carabine. It's not quite a, it's really a pistol caliber rifle, because you can't call the 1903 a carbine in any sense of the word.
Right.
But essentially it turned it into a rifle that's shooting a pistol caliber. So you're not quite up to the firepower of a submachine gun. Though, again, at the time, the submachine gun was the Thompson. And so when you realize what a big, heavy gun that is and how small and light this Pedersen device was, it really was amazing that you could do kind of a quick swap. Yes,
absolutely. And it doesn't require any new training. You've got guys that already know how to use the 03, and they know how to remove the bolt, and that's really all it takes. If you can field strip and remove a bolt and slide this thing back in, they know how to insert a magazine because they've worked with the 1911 pistols. It just was designed to be really user friendly, and require no extra training. So it was supposed to be an incredibly convenient thing for our guys and just give them a tremendous boost in firepower in terms of numbers of rounds, not necessarily firepower in terms of the power of the cartridge.
Yeah, that's one of those things, just like the FP Liberator 45, that is just one of those things that, oh man, I mean, I'm glad we never ended up using it because war is awful, but at the same time, it seems like such a great innovation that I really would have loved to have seen how well it would have worked in that time frame.
Yeah, it really would have been fascinating to see how the spring offensive would have played out. Would it have dragged on into the summer, into the fall? And we don't know. But I would like to think that it probably would have been done by the summer of 1919. But again, maybe that's just hopeful Yanks perspective on things, looking back at the war. Who knows? The soldiers might have found, again, like I did, that they're a little finicky and hard to service in the field, and that maybe they wouldn't have been as effective as we had hoped they would be. But again, that's just one of those what ifs, one of those many what ifs of history that we'll simply never know about. But nonetheless, it's a really cool design that he came up with to fix a problem. And like you'd said, thank God we didn't end up needing to use this design, because it ended up saving countless lives because the war ended up over before it was needed.
So we've kind of jumped around a little bit in history, talking about his earlier works, and we were just talking about World War I, though last time we were talking about the pre-World War II trials with the M1 Garand versus the Pedersen rifle. So what happens during and after World War II for John Pedersen?
So the really interesting thing with Pedersen during World War II is, of course, there are tons of arms designs being produced by tons of different contracts and trying to churn out the amount of guns that the Allied forces need. And it's the same thing with the M1 carbine. And so Pedersen teams up with the Irwin family. I believe they're based out of Michigan. And he teams up with them. They've got the money. He's got the government contacts, and they secure a contract to make the M1 carbine, a contract to make 100,000 of them. But once again, that constant nagging too little too late jumps in there in Pedersen's career, and there are issues with production, and they only ended up making about 3,500 of them, making it the rarest of the M1 carbine out there. And then the rest of the contract ended up being given to Saginaw. And so they finished out the other 90-some thousand guns that Irwin Pedersen never got around to. So if you happen to find an Irwin Pedersen carbine at a decent price, pick it up, because it'll definitely be worth having. Unfortunately for Pedersen, military contracts are really not his thing. He just seems to be thwarted at every turn trying to get these squared away. So he ends up going back to the civilian market, which does really well for him. He ends up going back to Remington, and they make the Model 10 shotgun. That's a pump action shotgun. They make about 275,000 of those. And then with some improvements to this design, we end up coming back to John Moses Browning again in the Remington Model 17 shotgun, which was a Browning design that Pedersen ended up working on as well, and making some different alterations to the design to really put together and put to market a top-notch, high-quality shotgun. And that's what they get with the Model 17. But then things transition again, and we get a design that is really well known, and that people know even today because it's still in production, what goes on to become the Ithaca Model 37, which is just a fantastic shotgun. And knowing the history that it's got two of the greats involved in the design, John Browning and John Pedersen, it really becomes easy to understand why it's been such a successful shotgun throughout history. And so that's kind of Pedersen's career in a nutshell. He is a fantastic designer. He is lauded by John Moses Browning, calls him the greatest gun designer in the world. But Pedersen seems to be thwarted at a lot of turns, and the military contracts are just never there for him, whether it's with his pistol for World War I, his rifles with World War II, his carbines in World War II. Just doesn't work out for him. But thank God the civilian market and Remington does incredibly well by him. And so even though he's not terribly well known, he is definitely up there as one of the most influential firearms designers of the 20th century, and he really doesn't get his due.
Well, that's why I wanted to have you on to talk about that. You said talk about anything, and I said, geez, there really does need to be more talk on John Pedersen, because he's one of those, if you start digging through any historical stuff on firearms, it seems like, especially in American history, his name comes up almost as much as John Moses Browning, but again, almost always in Browning's shadow or something that competed against something else. And that is to say something about constantly being in second place is not really a bad place to be. So
yeah, second place is not bad if the person who's directly in front of you is Browning, you know?
Exactly. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Logan Metesh of High Caliber History. Really appreciated having you on, and hopefully we'll hear from you again soon.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.